In the wake of the abduction, rape, and murder of Sarah Everard by serving Met police officer Wayne Couzens, the Home Office ordered a report into how the police vet new candidates. The Met had found itself under particular scrutiny because Wayne Couzens had managed to become a firearms officer, even though they had received reports he'd committed indecent exposure. The report has now been published by the inspectorate responsible for policing the police, and it makes for some pretty shocking reading. We found officers and staff with criminal records, or suspicions that they had committed crime, including some serious crime, as well as substantial undischarged debt, or family members linked to organised crime. In other cases, officers and staff had given false or incomplete information to the vetting unit. We also found officers who, despite a history of attracting complaints or allegations of misconduct, successfully transferred between police forces. Most worryingly, it's clear these concerns don't just apply to a small few within the force. Matt Parr from the Inspectorate spoke to BBC Breakfast.
About 1 in 5 of them is somebody we think either just shouldn't have joined, or if they were going to join, should have had some special controls put around them. I don't think it's being taken seriously enough. I don't think police leadership realises how important it is. I don't think police leaders realise the risk they carry by not having higher vetting standards, and therefore it's too easy for the wrong people to get in.
1 in 5 is a lot. But it gets even worse. The report arrived at the figure by reviewing 725 vetting files, in which 131 decisions were, quote, questionable at best. To put that in perspective, since 2019, 15,000 new officers have been recruited to the police force. So if 1 in 5 of those are too dangerous to be in that role, that makes for 3,000 new police recruits who could present a danger to the public. But how dangerous are the officers who should have never passed the vetting process? One example from the report states this. An applicant for the Special Constabulary was granted vetting clearance. In the mid-1990s, he received an adult caution for making threats to commit criminal damage. 6 years earlier, when he was a juvenile, he was convicted of indecent exposure and received a 12-month supervision order plus £25 in costs. Over a 13-year period, he applied 3 times to the same force but was rejected on each occasion. On the final occasion, he appealed and the vetting manager granted clearance. The rationale for this clearance included the passing of time since the applicant had last come to notice and the fact he was a juvenile when he was convicted of indecent exposure. The rationale stated there was minimal risk to the force. We examined the detail of the indecent exposure offence, which was available in the vetting file. This showed that over a 2-week period, the applicant had indecently exposed himself to the same woman on 7 separate occasions. On each occasion, he stood at his bedroom window, coughed to attract her attention, and then masturbated. Minimal risk. After exposing himself to the same woman 7 times in a fortnight. You know who else was convicted for indecent exposure? Wayne Couzens. Though of course he was an adult at the time. Here's another case highlighted in the report. A police officer applicant was given vetting clearance. The applicant had a conviction for drink driving and driving with no insurance, 18 years prior to his application. 4 years later, he was arrested but not prosecuted for intimidating a witness. In the same year, he was also arrested for a domestic-related assault. A woman was left with marks to her neck. There was no evidence on the vetting file to confirm or refute whether these 2 arrests were linked. 5 years before his application, the applicant was again arrested for a domestic-related assault. In this case, too, a woman allegedly suffered injury marks to her neck. The rationale focused on the passing of time, stating that the traces on applicant are significantly aged. There was no evidence that the force had considered the full circumstances of the offences, including the reasons for no further action being taken for any of the arrests. The rationale didn't make any comment on the fact that 2 separate domestic-related incidents had occurred where 2 women were both allegedly left with marks to their neck. So those are 2 violent misogynists being given policing roles by, well, other misogynists. Because the report also uncovered a culture of rampant sexual abuse and harassment aimed at female officers. The inspectorate interviewed 41 women who work for or with the police. Some of those women reported sexual assault by male colleagues both in the workplace and at social events. But many other forms of serious sexual misconduct were reported too, including these. Viewing pornography at work by, for example, male officers, including supervisors, viewing pornography on suspects' phones, not as part of investigations, and inviting other officers to view the images on the screen, sending pornography to female colleagues' phones, inappropriate sexual comments by male officers, including comments about a victim's breasts, comments about vulnerable sex workers who are victims of crimes, and many other disparaging and insulting comments about female victims in general. At work-related social events, a senior male officer pestering a female colleague for sex, he sought to take advantage of those who he could see had clearly been drinking alcohol. Senior male officers pursuing women in lower ranks for sex, including via the force email system. Male officers making a point of stopping cars driven by women they regard as pretty, a practice they refer to as booty patrol, and male officers, including supervisors, making sexually explicit comments about female members of the public. That was all from just 41 women. And in many cases, the perpetrators had previously been reported for similar acts, which hadn't been taken seriously by their superiors. In total, the report found a culture of misogyny in every single one of the police forces they reviewed. Of course, this is only the latest in a long line of investigations revealing misogyny and racism in Britain's police forces.
I think that what you've described shows three problems, right? One is a culture of misogyny, which is tolerated and even encouraged within the ranks. Another problem is what kind of people are attracted to applying to become part of the police force. And then the third problem is, of course, the one you mentioned, which is about the way in which the so-called safeguards are totally unfit for purpose. And I think when you combine all three of those things, that tells you that you have a structural problem at almost every level of policing. I mean, I think that it doesn't come as a huge surprise that there are people who are attracted to the police force who want to do that job, not because they're necessarily super community minded, but because they really enjoy the feeling of power and impunity in the exercise of that power that the job gives you. I think that there's also a sense that there is a, root to branch problem of misogyny not only being tolerated, but embedded within how disciplinary decisions are being made. So the examples that you've given here of men in plain sight acting in ways which are harassing to women, which include sexual assault of women, and which also include using their powers as police officers to harass and degrade women. That tells you something about what they think is going to happen to them if their superiors or if their colleagues become aware of their actions. So again, that's telling you something about a structural problem. There's also a statistic which came to light earlier this year, which is that 80% of police officers and staff who are accused of domestic violence keep their jobs. Now, when you think about other sections of the public sector, take social work or medicine or teaching, these are not things that would be tolerated in any of these other professions. And I can't really think of another aspect of public service where you're going to be coming into contact with more vulnerable people, because as a police officer, you have powers given to you under the Mental Health Act, which means that you're coming into contact with mentally vulnerable people. You'll be coming into contact with children. You'll be coming into contact with victims of abuse. So the fact that these behaviors are tolerated, are seen as banter or seen as funny, that tells you a lot about how the police as an institution view their duty of care. And just on the point about, what kind of people are drawn to policing, I used to work at a pub, and there was this one guy who we all had to work with, and he was awful. He was just always really sexually inappropriate. I remember once kicking him in the face because he'd bent down to get a bottle and then tried to touch my leg, and I was like, absolutely not. And he also spoke at length about how he thought that Roma people should be rounded up. what was the job that he wanted more than anything else? It was to be a police officer. I think he was rejected by the Met and eventually taken up by the British Transport Police. So I think that tells you about this kind of syncretism between the kind of people who want to join the police force and the kind of behaviours which are either tacitly or explicitly encouraged or protected by the institution of policing. So the whole barrel is rotten, Dahlia. It's not just a case of 20% of the apples are rotten.
You'd think that tackling these toxic cultures in police forces would be a government priority, but this is what Home Secretary Suella Braverman has decided to focus on instead. Home Secretary Suella Braverman blasts police force for playing identity politics over jailed trans women. And recently, various newspapers have reported this. Fighting actual crime, Rishi Sunak prepares to launch pushback against woke policing. Ash, what do you make of these headlines? We've been hearing a lot more about this danger of woke policing. What has wokeness and identity politics got to do with the police abusing their power?
I mean, look, it's got absolutely nothing to do with it, but this tells you just how deranged this anti-woke moral panic really is. It is totally divorced from reality. Because if you were to take just a cursory glance at the state of policing over the last 2 years, what you would find are systemic problems of violence, misogyny, and racism. And even if you aren't an abolitionist, even if you are just, your regular, middle of the road, average voter, you would say, look, there's clearly a breakdown of trust between the police and the public who they expect to consent to being policed. All right. That is a problem. Absolutely nobody, if they were left to their own devices, untroubled by the headlines of the Daily Mail or the Telegraph or the Spectator, would go, okay, well, the problem is that the police are too woke. Quite frankly, it's because the police are too rapey. That's the problem. And so this is totally divorced from reality. And it just shows you that if you are the kind of politician to entertain moral panics, you're not a serious politician. You're not someone who is serious about governing and overseeing the institutions which dictate our daily lives. I mean, look, I think that, you should get a kind of, one moral panic warning as a politician. You feed one, you get a warning, you feed two, and then you're kicked out. Because honestly, it just shows that you're totally unfit for the job.